Awesome. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Isabel Mann. I'm the Teacher Programs and Curriculum Specialist here at the National World War II Museum. Before coming to the World War II Museum, I worked at a much smaller institution in Georgia that focused specifically on the Holocaust. And then before that, I was a classroom teacher. And so both when I was teaching in the classroom and when I was a museum Holocaust educator, I used resources from the Institute for Curriculum Services, which is why I was so excited when Dori reached out to me when I first started working here at the World War II Museum and asked me if, we would be willing to partner with her to host a professional development for teachers on the history of European anti-Semitism. Their resources and curriculum that they offer for teachers are really, really strong. And speaking from personal experience of adapting their curriculum for teaching middle school students about the Holocaust, all of these resources are incredibly helpful. And so I would like to introduce Dori Gerber. She is a Southern Region trainer and educator with the Institute for Curriculum Services. And so she'll be leading a big chunk of this professional development and diving into not only this history, but strong and best teaching practices for this as well. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn the mic over to Dori. But I'll be back in a little bit to talk about the resources my institution offers.
Yep, this is chock full of resources for you all this afternoon. Thank you so much, Isabel. Thank you so much for this partnership, for this collaboration. I'm really excited to lead this today. It's really incredible seeing everyone's diversity here in the chat box, what's bringing everyone together here. Lots of educators, which is really what our focus will be. I want to just make that very clear as we get started. This is going to be academically focused on how this can be used as an instructional tool within the classroom when teaching about anti-Semitism as a kind of introduction to the Holocaust as well. And like Isabel said, we are going to focus on not only the content, but some pedagogical best practices in order to do so. So even if you're not a classroom teacher, there's going to be lots of history for you to glean from this. So we're thrilled that you're here. Wonderful to see so many of you here. Again, like such diverse backgrounds and reasons for being here. We're just thrilled to have you. So that being said, we're going to get started in the content of history of European anti-Semitism. I'm going to get started by sharing a little bit about the Institute for Curriculum Services, so you know a little bit about who we are, what we do. We are a nonprofit education initiative. We're actually based in San Francisco, California, although I'm zooming into you from the Orlando, Florida area, as I'm more of the Southern region, Eastern Seaboard educator. And so one of my lucks that would have it is that I'm in a position to be able to connect with Isabel and the amazing work that they do at the museum. And that's how we were able to bring this workshop to you all today. But our mission at ICS is that we are dedicated to improving the quality of K through 12 education on topics that are related to Judaism, Jewish history, and Israel in the United States. And we do this by developing standards-aligned curricula and providing professional development such as this to teachers around the country. What we do is we know what are general themes as far as standards across the country when it comes to these particular topics. And through the request of educators around the United States, we develop these resources to support the teachers when teaching these very complex and complicated topics, to ensure and to give them the confidence that they have tools that they can use in their classroom when instructing on these topics. So that's a little bit about, how we go about doing what we do, because ultimately we believe that an excellent education is essential to building a strong civil society where all people can flourish. I'd also like to draw your attention to the little logo there on the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. We are very, very proud to be consortium members of the Library of Congress's Teaching with Primary Sources program. We went through a very rigorous application process in order to get that distinction. But as I said, it's one we're very proud of because it really highlights our commitment to ensuring that our materials are rooted in primary sources to help students think critically and independently when making meaning about historical and current events. That's very, very important to us. What you'll see here on the screen for my educators that are here with us today, these are the topics that we offer through our free resources that are available on our website, as well as through professional development opportunities. I want to just give a quick mention here that if any of you are interested in having training brought to your school district, please reach out to me. We'll be sure to have my email shared at the end of the session so we can make sure that that happens. The blue would be the kind of subject areas under the social studies history umbrella, the maroon being the specific topic titles themselves, okay? So again, a little bit about who we are and what we do. The last thing that I want to mention is that we do offer an online course. Right now, we're running our asynchronous version of teaching the history of the Arab-Israeli conflict through primary sources. If that is something that you'd be interested in learning more about, please take a look at the link that's in the chat box. And then in the fall, we will be offering our synchronous option for that as well. But let's, without further ado, talk about what we will be covering today. So we're going to start with a definition of anti-Semitism. We will be tracing the trajectory of anti-Semitism in European history, stopping before World War II. And I'm going to pause here for a moment and really explain what I mean about that. And stopping before the Holocaust, I should say. One of the main goals of this session, and one of the reasons we developed it, was to attempt to answer a common question that is often asked by students, right? How did the Holocaust happen? So our goal is that through exploring 2,000 years of the evolution of anti-Semitism, we'll provide you with the historical context to then help students begin to answer that question. So I call this the prequel, if you will, to Holocaust education, because again, it helps to provide the context to how that could have ever happened in the first place, okay? And then you'll see that we'll spend some time looking at some primary sources related to the topic. We'll be doing some analysis, so be ready to participate through the chat box. And as always, with all of the workshops that ICS offers, we provide access to ready-to-use resources for instructional use, okay? So if we're focusing on the history of anti-Semitism, which I made a really big deal about telling you why are we starting with these very modern images? Well, the reason is that I think it's really important for us to frame our conversation with these images, to remind us that within the last several years, there has been an uptick in anti-Semitic incidents, both here in the United States and around the world, right? Attacks on synagogues, schools, desecration of Jewish cemeteries, for example, are explicit infringements that interfere with the concrete realities and practices of an individual's religious life. And there was a recent report that was done from the United Nations, and it stated that anti-Semitism expressed through these types of acts that I just shared, violence towards Jews specifically violates a number of human rights, right? Including the right to freedom of religion or of belief. So again, as we begin to investigate the past, I think it's really important for us to make connections to what is happening today, okay? I mentioned that we are Library of Congress Teaching with Primary Sources Consortium members. I'm just going to ask a question for a really quick response in the chat box. Give me a Y for yes, N for no. I am familiar with the Library of Congress's Teaching with Primary Sources tools. Go ahead and let me know. Okay, looks like there's a good variety here. For those of you not familiar, let me draw your attention to what you see here on the screen. The link will be shared in the session's resources, but we like to utilize the Library of Congress's source analysis strategies, which is observe, reflect, and question when it comes to analyzing primary sources. We also do utilize a variety of other strategies, but this is one that we're going to be talking about in our session today. For those of you that this would be helpful and pertain to, if you are teaching with primary sources and you are looking for sort of prompts or question sets that can help guide your students to the analysis, you can use this link here and notice that there are a variety of types of primary sources listed here. Clicking on those links will provide you with question sets specifically to those types of sources. I think we often think that primary sources are just documents. As you can see here, there are a variety of types of primary sources, of which we're going to actually explore some in our presentation today. Okay, so just wanted to bring that to your attention. We're actually going to do a little bit of a practice with the observe, reflect, and question strategy here by looking at a magazine cover from a French publication called La Libre Parole. This cover was printed in October 1893. Now I said this was a French publication. Let's hone in on the date, 1893, October 1893. We're getting close to 1894. Anyone have an idea of what was taking place in France, 1894, that might be somewhat associated or related or connected? Yep, Eleanor, you guys got it. You're so smart, everybody. The Dreyfus Affair. That's what we are going to refer to later on, but keep in mind the time period and notice the cover here. Okay. Now, doing this with students, what I would recommend is not sharing the source information at the very beginning. Obviously, they're not going to be going into it with maybe the same amount of background knowledge or content understanding that most of us have here in this session today. So you're going to be using this as part of a lesson or several lessons on this particular topic. So you're building their content, you're building their context. So by not sharing the source information in from the get-go, allows them some deeper analysis, gives them the opportunity to ask more questions, okay? So I want to approach this little practice here that we're going to do really, really quickly from the lens of students, okay? Not from the lens of those of us sitting here with 40 years of instructional experience on this topic. I want to do this from the lens of students. So if the first way that we're going to approach this is through observation, that's what I want us to do. I want to do this very literally. In the chat box, tell me the things you see that you notice when looking at that cover, okay? Go ahead and populate the chat box with your observations. Try really hard to refrain from making those inferences just yet. Okay, there's someone hugging the globe. There's shoddy clothing, money falling out of pockets. Yep, hugging the world, menacing the world. Interesting. I'm curious, Mary, I'm going to call you out for a moment. Tell me why you use the word menacing, and you can unmute or you can put it into the chat box. Look at all these great responses I'm seeing. Excellent, excellent, excellent. So what many of you are saying is shoddily dressed, that there is a globe, that there is a person gripping the globe, that the person has a large nose, that there is money coming out of this person's pocket, okay? There is a sun and a moon, and this is a black and white image with very little color. This person looks like a frog. Very interesting, right? Okay, now we're going to make some reflections, some inferences. Now we're going to ask our students to draw on the context that they've been receiving through their lessons, through their research, to make some inferences here. So looking at some of the question prompts here, what is the historical context? What stereotypes are present? Who might the audience be, right? So let's make some inferences. Why that gripping on the globe? What might that have to do with anything? Why the large nose, do we think? Why the shabbily dressed man with the money hanging out of the pockets? What might the reasoning be behind those things? Feel free to share in the chat box. Okay, so stereotype of Jews having a large nose. Yes, okay, so the stereotype of Jews being greedy, okay, is starting to emerge at this period of time. And the fact that this man is shoddily dressed, but yet has money spilling from his pockets could be an allusion to that stereotype of greediness, okay? Also the stereotype of Jews wanting to control the world, right? We're going to be talking about that in a minute. Martin, I like that inference, however, Jews outside of the world, attached to it, but not part of it. That is such an interesting perspective. And I will tell you, educators, that is one of the greatest things about working with primary sources. Students are making interpretations by applying their content level of understanding, their background knowledge, their personal level of knowledge. And as long as they are able to explain their reasoning with academic facts and evidence, it's not a wrong answer, right? So that could be Jews, Martin saying that his inference is that's Jews outside of the world attached to it, but not part of it. And others are saying this is referring to Jews and the stereotype of world control, okay? And then the last thing that you would do with students is have them come up with more questions, right? What questions come to mind when you look at this image? Why is it in black and white with orange? What was the reason behind that? Great opportunity for interdisciplinary learning. Work with an art teacher to kind of talk about how, colors were selected for specific drawings and things like that. Why would someone put this on the cover of a magazine? All right, Mary, I'm going to answer that question for you. Ready? I'm going to give you some interesting information. So the founder and editor of this newspaper, La Libre Parole, was a man named Edward Drummond. He founded the Anti-Semitic League of France in 1889. Now we have a little more understanding of the intention of the publisher of this particular cover and this magazine. And we also have more information now as to the intended audience, right? Okay. Why is it so recognizable without a caption? Yep, interesting. Speaking of caption, FYI, right here it says leur patrie. That means their homeland. Excellent job analyzing this. We kind of went a little bit ahead of time in our timeline here because I wanted to do a little bit of practice of analyzing primary sources and give you some strategies and skills to use with students. We're now going to go back in time, okay, in a little bit after we break down the definition of anti-Semitism, which is what I shared with you before. And also we're going to unpack some names that are referred to Jewish people, okay? So I'm going to first talk with Hebrews, right? Talk about Hebrews. And that also, we're going to also take a look at Israelites. So when broadly describing the same people over different points of time, the terms Hebrews and Israelites are ancient terms that are found in the first 5 books of Moses. Now, neither term is appropriate for describing modern day Jews, okay? So if you are teaching about Jews or Judaism you should only be referring to them as Hebrews or Israelites in the biblical or historical context. All right. We'll talk about the actual term Jews. Okay. This became the name that refers to the Jewish people as an ethnic and religious group from 722 BCE to the present. Okay. This is after the northern kingdom Israel was destroyed in 722 BCE. Okay. Judaism is the monotheistic religion of the Jewish people. Now, while Judaism is the religion of the Jewish people, not all Jews consider themselves religious or practice Judaism. And then when we're looking at the term Israeli, okay, it's important to know that that is synonymous with citizenship, right? Just as American is synonymous with citizenship here in this country. Some people use the term Israeli as a synonym for Jew, but this is an inaccurate, right? As Israeli is referred to citizenship and includes people of different faiths and ethnicities, just like being an American does here in the United States. So now let's break down the definition of the term anti-Semitism. It was coined back in 1879 by a German gentleman named Wilhelm Marr. And it was in contrast to previous centuries when the hatred or prejudice against Jews was anchored in anti-religious conviction, or what was called anti-Judaism, okay? Marr used this word anti-Semitism to emphasize the perceived racial inferiority of the Jews. And this was occurring during a time when the ideas about the biology of race were developing and being used to justify control over minority populations, both in Europe and in the United States, okay? We also talk about, should we hyphenate the term anti-Semitism or not? I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. I'll let you take a look at the slide here. But technically, the word should not be hyphenated. And we kind of use Deborah Lipstadt as our barometer on this, and you can learn more about that from her most recent book. But basically, what we've learned from her is that the placement of a hyphen after the term anti, right, after the prefix anti, would indicate that anti-Semitism refers to all people who speak Semitic languages like Arabic, Hebrew, Aramaic, right? Or those that are classified as Semites. But as we just discussed on the previous slide, this new term anti-Semitism really came into use to describe anti-Jewish campaigns at the time. And today, anti-Semitism is used to describe and analyze past and present forms of opposition or hatred only towards Jews, okay? So if your word processor wants to hyphenate it, say no. And also, just another interesting fact, it should only be capitalized if it's in a title or the first word of a sentence. Okay. So during our presentation today, we're going to kind of unpack some layers of anti-Semitism that have been accumulated over centuries. There's a scholar named William Brustein, and he identifies 4 historical forms of anti-Semitism. They're religious, economic, political, and racial. Now, as I mentioned, we're going to go way back in time, right? We started late 1800s with our image, but now we're going to go way back in time to the Roman Empire, where, as I mentioned, anti-Judaism was the oldest form of anti-Semitism, and it was very present in this time period. So at this time, keep in mind, Judaism was a monotheistic religion in a polytheistic world, right? Jews wouldn't worship Roman gods. They kept their cultural identity, so they were viewed as outsiders who resisted Roman rule. And so therefore, they were denigrated for many of the things that you see there on the screen. And it's important for us to talk about Jesus in this particular context, right? So we know that he was born and that he died as one of the Jewish people. And in his short life on earth, He taught a message of love and how to lead a good life in the tradition of other Jewish teachers. Now, to our knowledge, neither Jesus nor any of his followers left any written records, but what we do have is a set of documents that were written and then collected in the generations after Jesus's death in and around 30 CE. Now, Brustein, a scholar that I mentioned on the previous slide, he points out that Jews and Christians have a very unique relationship, one that's different than, say, the relationship between Christianity and Hinduism or Islam and Buddhism, because they started out as siblings in Judea, which was a remote province of the Roman Empire. Now, in the second part of the Christian Bible or the New Testament, the seeds for this religious precursor to anti-Semitism or anti-Judaism are sown. And it's important to note that the New Testament's context is critical to understanding what's going on, right? There was this negative depiction of Jews in these texts because it reflected an internal debate between Jews who believed that Jesus was the Messiah and then traditional Jews who did not view Jesus as sacred. Now, in time, as more Gentiles come to believe in Jesus, much harder lines are drawn between these two groups. Now, while the Romans destroyed the temple in Jerusalem in 70 CE, okay, at this time, many Jews were killed or they were forced to leave the land of Judea. And so by the 11th century, small Jewish communities in countries throughout Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa started to appear. Most of the sects of Judaism that had existed were wiped out. Those that remained, however, like those that were Jesus's followers, they were forced to reinvent themselves, and that would then usher in the onset of Christianity. And you'll notice as we go through our conversation today that resettlement is a common theme throughout Jewish history. Now, what we know is that Jesus was killed by the Romans, as were countless others who were seen as a threat to Roman rule. But early Christians who were angry that Jews didn't believe Jesus was the Son of God or the Messiah, and really also wanting Roman citizens to follow their new Christian religion, taught that it was Jews, not the Romans, who were to blame for the crucifixion of Christ. Now, this was a myth that led to hundreds of years of persecution, and it was the basis of religious anti-Semitism. Now, what I want to point out is that since World War II, okay, there have been various Christian denominations that have taken steps to disavow this charge of deicide or the blaming of Jews for Jesus's death. Now, one example would be with the Catholic Church and the Second Vatican Council's Nostra Aetate, which was in 1965. And a more recent example would have been in 2011 when Pope Benedict explicitly exonerated Jews from all blame for the crucifixion and death of Jesus in his book, Jesus of Nazareth. Okay. Now, after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in 476 CE, political power in the Middle Ages became linked to the church, right? The church controlled all aspects of life, which was really seen as preparation for life after death. Now, anyone that was not a Christian was regarded as the enemy, or an enemy, I should say. And during the medieval period, right, anti-Judaism was prevalent. So in addition to the restrictions on Jewish life and religious practice that were set out by the Romans and their legal codes, Christians added laws in the medieval period that really attempted to further any sort of fraternization or interaction between Jews and Christians, right? These anti-Jewish laws are found in the codes of Constantine, Constantius, Theodosius II. Many of these laws persisted long after the collapse of the Roman Empire. They made their way into the legal codes of European empires and countries, They also influenced Muslim legal codes, okay? Do you notice anything else that they may have influenced as well? Any other laws from other time periods of history that they look familiar? Taking a look at the anti-Jewish laws on the right-hand side of the screen, do they remind you of anything else? Do they remind you of laws from another period of time? Yeah, Jim Crow, Lee, you got it. And the Nuremberg laws, exactly. So Nuremberg laws, Jim Crow laws, this was not a coincidence, okay? Those laws were absolutely developed, right, and influenced by these anti-Jewish laws of the medieval period, which we'll see it in a little while when we take a look at the Nuremberg laws. So we're going to take a look at art now as an example of a primary source. So the first one we looked at was the cover of the newspaper. Now we're going to take a look at art. Okay, so here you see on the left a statue named Ecclesia, whose name stems from the Greek word church or gathering. And on the right is a statue named Synagoga, whose name means synagogue. So these two figures are personifying Christianity and Judaism during the medieval period, okay? So we're going to use another strategy very similar to the observe, reflect, and question. This time it's called see, think, wonder. So I want to start with Ecclesia on the left-hand side, okay? Only with Ecclesia. In the chat box, tell me what you notice about her. What are your observations? Oh, she's stoic. Great word, Corinne. What else? Okay, she has a stern look. Interesting. All right, Ron, what else? What else do you notice about her? She can see, okay? Right? She's smiling. Yep, she's wearing a cape. She has a crown. She has a cup and a cross, right? She's a graceful look about her. Interesting, yep. An open demeanor. Great, great description there. Very feminine. Awesome. Now, let's pause for a moment and turn our attention to synagoga. Okay. Oh, okay. So Martin, I see what you said, holding symbols of Christian faith. Yes, right. We can clearly tell that Ecclesia is representative of the Christian faith, right? She has the cross, that she has a chalice, right? That is often associated with Christian religion, right? Okay. So if we take a look at synagoga on the right, she's blindfolded. She's more shabbily dressed, right? Expressionless, right? She has a broken staff or a bat. She's slouching. Excellent, excellent, excellent. So now that we've made some observations about them, let's make some inferences. Why the blindfold? Why is she blindfolded, do you think? Why is synagoga blindfolded? Ignorance. Okay, perhaps that was the perception of the artist, right? That she is not seeing what's happening, that she's following a blind faith, right? Okay, there is reference to the bat that she's holding to be an allusion of the lance that stabbed Christ. Notice she has a book dropping from her hands, slipping from her hands. There is a reference to that being the Torah, that the grip on the Torah is slipping. Yep, the book equals law. Exactly. There's so many other things to unpack here, right? Like we can ask some questions as to if there's a clear distinction between the two, one obviously being portrayed more negatively than the other. Why are they both wearing crowns? That could be a question students ask, right? They're both wearing these robes that have stripes. One has stripes on the clothing. They're alternate in color. Why is that? Is that intentional? All sorts of things to unpack. Again, using art as a primary source really brings the learning to life for students. Again, we're not just asking them to analyze a document to interpret history. Okay. Now, as we continue to understand religious anti-Semitism, right, I want to point out that in Italy, during the 13th century, as well as other countries in Europe, Jews were marginalized. They were forced to live in separate areas of town. They were excluded from all activities in mainstream society. These areas were often gated and locked at night. Okay. Does this sound familiar to anybody? This is 13th century. Does this sound familiar? What connections are we making to this 13th? Yeah, the ghettos, exactly. Now take a look at that third bullet, right? The English word ghetto is believed to be derived from the Italian word gioto, which means foundry, because the first Jewish quarter in Venice was near a foundry that once made cannons. That's the origin of this term ghetto, okay? This is an excellent opportunity to have a conversation with students about this word. What connotation this word has in American culture, right? How it got to have that connotation, and making the connections to the origin of the word to the modern understanding of the word, okay? And kind of tracing the trajectory of the evolution of that term. Now, the church councils in the Middle Ages, they restricted interactions between Christians and Jews. The Lateran Council, which was convened by Pope Innocent III, is an example of this. Now, in 1215, in parts of Germany, Jews were required to wear these cone-shaped hats like you see there on the screen. This was so that they wouldn't be mistaken for real Germans, okay? In other European countries, they were required to wear yellow badges on their clothing to identify them as Jews. This was 730 years before Hitler began his anti-Semitic regime in Germany, okay? So what we're starting to put together here is that the things that Hitler connected with were parts of history where Jews were marginalized and treated differently, okay? He did not necessarily invent these ideas. What we know that he did was perfect them, okay? So we're going to talk about the form of anti-Semitism that we referenced earlier, economic anti-Semitism, okay? And look at that, where the stereotype of Jews being greedy began to take root. So in the Middle Ages, there were very few career options that were open to Jews, that were available for Jews to hold. And under the manorial system, they couldn't own land, they couldn't farm, they were not allowed to join the craft guilds. So working as traveling merchants or peddlers or jewelers, things that were portable, right, were really among the very limited professions that were available to them. Now, usury, which is money lending with the collection of an extremely high interest, was against Christian law. It was also against Jewish law, but money lending became one of the very few professions available for Jews during this time. So desperate times calls for desperate measures, maybe, you know, kind of putting that Jewish law behind in order to make a living for your family. Again, another opportunity for conversation with students about intentions, about people's reasons behind doing things, compromises, sacrifices, things like that. Now, Jews were often employed by feudal lords as tax or rent collectors. So when you're paying your mortgage or your rent every month, right? I'm pretty sure you're not doing it with a very gleeful click of the button to send that big chunk of change away, right? You're often feeling a little bit anxious about it, unhappy about it. So keep in mind the same thing was happening here in the Middle Ages, right? People disliked paying their taxes or owing money, which really led them to resent the Jews because they were doing the collecting, even though they were more so the messenger than the person that was actually getting paid for that money, right? Or owning that land. They couldn't own that land. So we see at this time violence against Jews beginning to rise. And again, this is where that stereotype of Jews being greedy began to take root. Right, exactly, Merlin, you got it. Now, while the form of economic anti-Semitism evolved during the Middle Ages, religious anti-Semitism, anti-Judaism was still very prevalent. And an example of this was the Crusades, right? In 1096, Pope Urban II called for the liberation of Jerusalem, and Christian crusaders set off to free the Holy Land from the non-believing Muslims. And then Jews were victimized as non-believers who lived in communities en route to the Middle East. Yep, exactly, Carla. Really good point. I love what I'm seeing there. Now, also in the Middle Ages, we see an increase in false accusations that are rooted in religious prejudice against Jews. Now, most peasants at this time could not read, so they were dependent on sermons by their clergy or visual images in order to learn about their religion and the non-believers, right? So at this time period, art would often depict Jews of having horns or talons and a forked tail. This association of the Jew with the devil was reinforced in the sermons that were being told, in folk tales. And in an age of superstition, Jews were being accused of black magic. If I can get you to think back to that very first image we looked at with that, someone referenced, that the man looked like a frog, almost animalistic, right? Because even though his hands and feet were gripping the globe, they were almost claw-like, right? Very animalistic. So again, we're seeing these, and that image came long after these Middle Ages images as well. So we're seeing the evolution of these stereotypes and the accusations of Jews being associated with the devil and the cause for bad things happening, right? And we're going to see more about that in just a moment. So one of those examples would be blood libel, right? The myth of the blood libel. So if a child went missing, it was often Jews that were to blame. The rumor was that Jews needed the blood of Christian children to mix into their preparation of matzah for Passover. Of course, this was completely untrue. We're still seeing in the 21st century charges of blood libel. We saw this very recently, even early back in 2021, if I'm not mistaken, we saw some charges of this. Now, Jews were also accused of spreading the Black Plague. Okay. Now, it was thought that they were poisoning wells in communities because they were not dying at the same rate as their Christian neighbors. What I wanted you to do now is think about realistically, scientifically, why might that have been? Why would the Jewish population not be dying off at the same rate as their neighbors if we're going to eliminate the thought of them poisoning wells? Okay. Smaller social circle, dietary rules, segregation. Tammy, right? Mary, remember, they were segregated. Here's our very first example of quarantining. So we can make connections again here with our students to what they've recently experienced with COVID and how that caused this group of people to have less of an impact from the plague than the other members of the community. And so obviously they weren't drinking from those wells because they weren't allowed near those wells, in addition to their strict dietary and hygiene practices as well. Okay, excellent. Yep, you all are getting it, nailing it right there in the chat box. Okay, so anti-Jewish prejudices resulted in Jews being expelled from most areas of Europe for a period of over 500 years. I mentioned to you earlier that resettlement was a common theme. So we noticed that Jews were driven from their homes and they often fled eastward, especially to the more tolerant kingdom of Poland, Lithuania. This is where the rulers there promised Jews safety and the allowance to work and travel and study and practice their religion freely. You'll notice too that many Jews settled in the Ottoman Empire, which was also the setting for the Arab-Israeli conflict, which is another one of our curriculum that I mentioned earlier in our conversation. Now, by the middle of the 16th century, 80% of the world's Jews lived in Poland. 80% of the world's Jews lived in Poland. At the start of World War II, the population of Poland was approximately 15% Jewish. Cities like Warsaw were seeing about 30% Jewish, Krakow 25% Jewish. Why are these statistics important? Why are these statistics important, do you think? Why am I pointing this out? And why would it be important to point this out to students? Where is the largest concentration of Jews at this point in time, right? At the start of World War II? In Poland, right? The death camps, exactly. Again, in what would eventually be controlled by Germany, right? So Hitler, again, was very smart. He went to where the largest population was and targeted them there. Exactly. Excellent. Great job, everybody. Now, in 1517, Martin Luther, who was a Roman Catholic monk in Germany, he attacked the Pope and the corruption within the Catholic Church, beginning the Protestant Reformation. He hoped that his tolerance would persuade Jews to convert. When that didn't happen, right, and he didn't adopt his new reformation of Christianity that like he had hoped, he lashed out against the Jews in his 1543 treatise concerning the Jews and their lies. And he says, "What then shall we Christians do with this damned, rejected race of Jews?" And you can see many of his suggestions there. And his views were not original. They represented much of Christian thought at this point in time. Now, by the mid-1800s, many Western and Central European Jews enjoyed some freedoms that were brought about by emancipation. Again, another great time to pause and speak with your students about the term emancipation and unpack that word with them and what that means in association to what we know with it in regards to American history, right? There's a lot to be compared and discussed about that term. And again, the evolution of that term. So again, many expected that Jews would give up their religion and adopt the lifestyle of the majority, and in effect, stop being Jewish. However, most Jews did not give up their beliefs or their traditional ways of life. So most Europeans saw this as a rejection of modern ways by very stubborn people, especially now that the Jews were free to leave the ghettos and live and work alongside their non-Jewish neighbors, right? There started to be this bit of a fear of encroachment on their territory, if you will. So we're switching now to the form of political anti-Semitism. Okay, now due to the emancipation of Jews, European anti-Semitism shifted from a more religious to a secular political form. There were these new nationalist ideologies that were spreading across Europe that were brought about by the French Revolution. They were further justifying resentment towards Jews, identifying them as these unwanted foreigners, especially since we saw many Jews from rural areas of what at that time was formerly Poland, because it was now part of the Roman Empire. They were migrating west to seek greater economic and educational opportunities. So again, this encroachment of these foreigners in their territory, okay? So keep that in mind as well. Now, this political cartoons are excellent primary sources, shows this trend of political anti-Semitism in Europe, right? It features Berlin court preacher Adolf Stoker. He was one of the earliest activists of the anti-Semitic political movement, and he's in a similar pose of Martin Luther and his 95 Thesis on the door of a synagogue. Now, Stoker was a theologian, and he campaigned against the Jews primarily on social issues. But immediately after his first anti-Semitic speech and the foundation of his Christian Social Party, the Weekly Klatterdash, which was a local German publication, published this cartoon. And on it, you see the phrase hep hep, right? And this was the battle cry of early anti-Semitic riots of 1819 in Romania. Another example of political anti-Semitism is this political cartoon from 1903 from a German weekly satirical magazine called Simplicissimus. Here you can see a Russian immigrant transforming himself from a poor ragman into a member of elite society. Now, anti-Semites saw the energy with which Jews made the most of their opportunities offered by this freedom in European society as a threat to their traditional values. And you can see the caption there as well. Now, France was the first European country to emancipate Jews in 1791, guaranteeing them freedom and equal rights of all its citizens, right? And so to Jews, this meant full citizenship without any conditions. But then in 1894, here we are referencing Alfred Dreyfus, which many of you shared earlier on in our time together. He was a Jewish officer in the French army, and he was falsely accused and convicted of treason. Now, although he was exonerated, the fact that he was convicted revealed the reality that a significant sector of the French population was concerned about having Jews in power, and they were willing to believe that all Jews, like Dreyfus, were likely traitors, right? This case was the impetus for Theodor Herzl's declaration of a Jewish homeland in Palestine, again, which we talk more about in our Arab-Israeli conflict curriculum. Now, while Western and Central European states, including England and Italy, were emancipating Jews, this did not happen in 19th century in Imperial Russia, where most of European Jews lived, right? We were seeing that there was mass discontent for the very poor living conditions for all Russians living in the country at the time. And so what we would start to see is that in an effort to divert this mass, discontent, Russian authorities were encouraging anti-Semitic violence. So many anti-Jewish riots or pogroms took place during the next 3 decades. We'll miss you, Robert, and we can get that to you, okay? Now, during this time, we noticed that about 2 million Jews left Russia between 1881 and 1914, mostly emigrating to the United States. And it wasn't until the Russian Revolution ended Tsarist rule that Jews finally became emancipated. Okay. Now, Nicholas II's power over his empire was fading as revolutionary groups were plotting to overthrow him. In 1905, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion was written, and it was said to be a secret plan of a group of powerful Jews who were plotting the collapse of all Christian countries to bring about Jewish world domination. So here again on the covers, you see the gripping of a stereotypical Jewish figure in an animal, in a snake, right? Gripping on the globe, very similar to that first image that we looked at, right? Now, we discovered that the book was a clever forgery by Russian secret police who intended to make it look as if revolutionaries who were going to overthrow the Tsar were controlled by Jews. Now, Henry Ford, yes, that Henry Ford of the Ford Motor Company, Rosemary, it is on our website, okay? He brought the Protocols of the Elders of Zion to the United States. Now, between 1920 and 1927, he translated the book in his newspaper, the Dearborn Independent. And he stated that and accused Jews through a series of articles that they used communism, banking, gambling, even jazz music to weaken the American people and their culture. Now, the protocols made it look as if the revolutionaries who wanted to overthrow the Tsar were controlled by Jews. Many Jews who supported the revolution in 1917 were socialists who took control of Russia under the leadership of Lenin in October of 1917. Anti-Semites, especially in Germany, made a very big deal about the fact that Lenin's second in command was Leon Trotsky, who happened to be Jewish. Now, just as in the Middle Ages, when Jews were wrongfully blamed for the Black Death, in the 20th century, Jews were now being blamed for a new plague that was sweeping Europe, communism, right? After communists took power in Russia, the protocols were reprinted throughout Europe and also in the United States, I should mention. So the book became very special, very popular in Germany, which was still reeling from its defeat in World War I. And its readership included, you guessed it, Army Corporal Adolf Hitler, right? The devastation of Germany's defeat in World War I and a fear of communist revolution fueled mass discontent within the Weimar Republic and its complex multi-party system. Yes, yes. This really radicalized this pre-existing right-wing anti-Semitic parties and gave rise to the Nazi Party, right? So the presence of the assimilated Jews in German life made them very convenient scapegoats for Germany's misfortune. This is an illustration of an Austrian postcard from 1919, and it shows a caricature Jew stabbing the German army in the back with a dagger. Now, the surrender in 1918 was blamed on the unpatriotic, the socialists, the Bolsheviks, the Republicans, and especially the Jews. Okay? Exactly, yes. Now, many Jews, or excuse me, I should say many Germans blamed the Jews for Germany's loss in the war, ignoring the fact that a higher percentage of German Jews fought in World War I than any other ethnic, religious, or political group in Germany. It's recorded that some 12,000 German Jews died for their country during World War I. We're going to now switch to the last form. We start to wrap things up here and take a look at racial anti-Semitism. Okay, in 1859, British scientist Charles Darwin, he published his book, The Origin of the Species. And in his book, he said that all life on Earth had evolved over millions of years, right? Some people misused or misinterpreted, whether it was intentional or not, Darwin's idea to claim that humans had evolved into distinct groups or races. And they thought at the top of these groups were the white Europeans or Aryan race, and the Jews were this separate Semitic race. And for those that were obsessed with the Jewish problem, the idea of a Semitic race meant that Jews were born different from other people, and so they could never become part of a mainstream society. This conversation about Jews and race and the Holocaust, again, became was a very current topic of conversation just several months ago when we saw this take place on, I believe it was The View with Whoopi Goldberg and some of the comments that she made. Now, Willem Marr and his fellow anti-Semites, Marr being the gentleman who coined the term anti-Semitism, he didn't believe that a person stopped being Jewish if they had converted to Christianity. For him and his cohorts, Jews would be members of this so-called Semitic race whatever their religion. So hatred of Jews for the religious reasons, right, the anti-Judaism that we saw prevalent for so many years, was now joined by this new idea that Jews were an inferior race. And again, the solution to this Jewish question that anti-Semites would argue was that they needed to leave Europe. Here we see the idea of scientific, I put this in quotes because it is absolutely not factual or actual, scientific anti-Semitism based on scientific racism, which was this pseudo-scientific belief that there was actual evidence that existed to justify or support racism. You see here photographs comparing Aryan and Semitic noses, right? Because proponents would use a number of different disciplines within sciences, as well as anthropology, right? To categorize people by their physical characteristics. So these images, the one on the left comparing Aryan noses to Semitic noses, as well as this image that comes from a children's book from the Nazi period called The Poisonous Mushroom, are also illustrations of this idea of scientific anti-Semitism, okay? Oh, interesting. Interesting, Carla. I've not heard that. That's a really interesting observation that your students have inferred. I appreciate you sharing that. Okay, so we're going to start to wrap up here, and then I'll be turning it over to Isabel. But I want to just kind of contextualize Hitler and his rise in power and how he began his anti-Semitic campaign, okay? So he believed all the lies that had ever been said about Jewish people since the early days of Christianity. He believed that the Jews were the greatest threat to the so-called Aryan race, and that either German people would defeat the Jewish race or be destroyed by what he saw as a Jewish communist menace. Now, in his book, Mein Kampf, he reveals how much really he had been taken in by the lies written in the protocols, and that once people read the book, the Jewish menace would be broken, right? The Nazi Party gained political strength through the late 1920s into the 1930s, really taking advantage of Germany's critical economic situation and lack of experience with a parliamentary democracy. Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany in January of 1933, and it's then where he starts to dismantle the Weimar Republic and implements his anti-Semitic program. Now, less than 3 months after coming into power in Germany, the Nazi leadership stages an economic boycott that targeted Jewish-owned businesses and offices of Jewish professionals. The boycott was presented to the German people as both a reprisal and an act of revenge for the bad international press that Germany was receiving since the appointment of Hitler's government. The Nazis claimed that German and foreign Jews were spreading atrocity stories to damage Germany's reputation. Nazi stormtroopers would stand menacingly in front of Jewish-owned stores and businesses and establishments, holding signs with slogans like you see there on the screen, "Don't buy from the Jews," and "the Jews are our misfortune." And, you know, this boycott only lasted one day, and it really was ignored by many individual Germans. But the boycott was significant because it marked the beginning of a nationwide campaign by the Nazi Party against the Jews in Germany specifically, and it would eventually culminate in the Holocaust. We know in 1935, Hitler enacted the Nuremberg laws. We know that they are heavily influenced from those medieval period laws, anti-Jewish laws that we saw. They excluded German Jews from Reich citizenship and prohibited them from really any sort of experiences that other German citizens had, as well as their fraternization with any other Germans, right? It prohibited that as well. We see here supplemental laws that were added to the Nuremberg laws. And at the bottom right-hand corner of the screen, you see where it says to be continued. This is where our timeline of events ends, right at the start of the rise of Hitler's anti-Semitic program and the onset of the Holocaust and then World War II. It is my hope that through all of this information and the resources that we shared and analyzed together, that you now have some more tools, some more information to help your students answer those common questions, right? Where did anti-Semitism come from? And how did the Holocaust happen? Okay. I'm going to turn it over to Isabel in just a moment. But before I do that, I'm going to share a link in the chat box, which is the link to the session's resources. Okay. And you can access that. It's all of the resources, including the link to the slide deck, is in there. And I'm going to turn this over to Isabel, who's going to share about how this relates to and connects with some of the resources that the museum has to offer. And I'm just going to make her the host and give her the opportunity to share her screen. And then at the end of the session, I'm going to be sharing a link to an evaluation for you that we would very much like for you to complete, as it's our feedback helps drive our instruction. So thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dori. And as Dori was saying, she really brought us right up to, the beginnings of the Holocaust, as well as the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party, and the beginning of World War II. And that's really where the National World War II Museum can come in and build off of all of that great history and all of those great teaching strategies that Dori just shared with you all. That history is really important. As a teacher and as a Holocaust educator at my last institution, the number one question I got from middle school students was, why did Hitler hate the Jews? And that sounds like a very simple question to answer, but as Dori kind of showed, the answer to that question is really complicated. And so you really need that long history of anti-Semitism to understand how someone like Hitler and the Nazi Party, how they rose to power and perpetrated something like the Holocaust. Now, the National World War II Museum has a lot of resources to kind of pick up where Dori left off, to explain about the beginning of World War II, how Hitler and the Nazi Party rose to power, as well as what happened specifically during the Holocaust. The World War II Museum has 4 different curriculum volumes. This curriculum series is called From the Collection to the Classroom. Those 4 volumes are War in the Pacific, War in Europe, The Home Front, and Liberation and Legacy, which talks about the end of World War II. Now, you can get any of these curriculum resources for free. If you want to email me, I'll share my email in the chat box and on my screen share shortly. But you can also get them just by going to our website. So if you email me and you want 10 copies of a specific curriculum guide, I will be able to ship you those physical copies. But all of those curriculum volumes, lesson plans, essays, videos, as well as lesson materials are actually on a website called worldwar2classroom.org. And so I'm going to go ahead and drop that link in the chat box so that you guys can open it up and save it. But I'm also going to switch my screen share so that you guys can see what this classroom website looks like. So this is worldwar2classroom.org. This is where all of our curriculum resources live online. And so when you go to this website, if you do not have a login account with this website, you'll be asked to register. So you see that red button that says View My Classroom. If you don't have an account, that'll actually be a register button. And so I highly suggest if you are a teacher to go to this website where we have all of our curriculum volumes. Go ahead and register. It'll ask you some information about your email and what school you teach at. But then that will give you access to all of our curriculum volumes online. And so I did just want to highlight one of the lessons in our curriculum volume, the war in Europe. This lesson is specifically about life in the concentration camp Auschwitz. And so you can see here all of the resources for war in Europe, the lesson plans. And if you go down a little bit, the essays and videos are also will pop up for you. And all you have to do is click download and you have access to this lesson plan and to the materials as well. So this is just one example of a lesson plan about World War II and the Holocaust that we can offer for teachers to take and adapt to the needs of their students. Included in this particular lesson is a variety of primary sources that you can use, and then maybe use some of the teaching strategies that Dori went over during her presentation as well. Many of these primary sources come from our museum's collections, and so they either tie to collections that we actually have on display here at the museum, or they tie to oral history interviews that are part of our collections as well. And so the way that we have all of this set up is that they're tied to national standards. It gives suggestions for procedures and how you can use these primary sources to cultivate student critical thinking skills. They also connect to overview essays as well that provide you and your students more historic context for these primary sources. You'll also notice that many of our lesson plans have a little box here that have online resources. So this is usually video content that you can access at worldwar2classroom.org that you can use as supplemental resources for your students as well. And so I did, with the time that we have left, want to show you one of our oral history clips that you might want to incorporate in your classroom when you're teaching about the Holocaust. As part of our oral history collection, we do have a lot of oral history clips from individuals who survived the Holocaust. And so I do want to take a moment to highlight the oral history clip for that lesson. Her name is Charlotte Weiss. You can find this oral history clip both on worldwar2classroom.org or on our YouTube channel as well. Just a little bit about Charlotte. She was born in 1924 in Czechoslovakia, or what is now Czechoslovakia. During this time period, it was Slovakia. And she was born to a Jewish family. She and her family lived on a farm, and she and her siblings were able to attend school until Nazi Germany occupied Czechoslovakia. At that point, she and her siblings were no longer allowed to attend public school in their hometown. Once Nazi Germany occupied Czechoslovakia, they very quickly replicated the Nuremberg laws that they had instituted in Nazi Germany, and then they went even further. And so Weiss, her sisters, and other family members eventually were transported or deported to Auschwitz. Only Weiss, her sisters, and their father were able to survive the Holocaust. Her mother, her younger brother, and most of her extended family were murdered in Auschwitz. And so I just want to go ahead and show you this clip of Charlotte talking about her experiences at Auschwitz. And as we watch this clip, I want you to think about how you might incorporate this kind of testimony into your classroom, how you might use primary source analysis strategies with your students to help them understand her story and the historical context of her story. And I also want you to think a little bit about how her story and her experiences during the Holocaust connect to all of that long history of European anti-Semitism that Dori just went over with us. And once we watch this clip, we'll have a moment to discuss some of this clip and her story in the chat box.
There's no sound.
Can you guys not hear?
I can hear.
Oh, you can hear? Okay, perfect.
There's no sound.
So it sounds like a few of you guys are having trouble hearing, but then some of you are able to hear. So Dori, I don't know if I have.
You do. I think it's that they're hearing you and I speak, but they're not hearing the video.
Okay.
So if you, when you click on share screen, you want to click on that audio option at the bottom.
Thank you.
No worries.
I had not done that.
It's all good. That's what we're here for, support each other. This is education, folks.
In
right?
1938,
Are flexible.
13-year-old
And I'm just going to fast forward a little bit to.
The sound works now for me.
Okay, perfect. I'm sorry about that technical issue.
Welcome to the world of virtual
the
teaching.
annexed Czechoslovakia in 1939, life for Weiss and the other Jews of the region worsened. In the spring of 1944, Weiss, with her siblings and mother, were forced from their home and into the Matazalka ghetto.
One day, they came and they told us to line up. They put us into cattle trains, about 80 to 100 people into a wagon. Nothing to eat. They just put a bucket there in case somebody has to go, and some water, which wasn't much, and it was terrible. So when we were about 3 days in the trains, we finally reached Auschwitz. And there were German soldiers screaming, "Get out, you verfluchte Juden! Get out, get out!" Babies were crying, people were crying, and we were shaken. We knew the end is not going to be good.
Weiss and the others exited the train. In the grass lay massive piles of glasses and clothes of the Jews brought there before them.
What I saw in Auschwitz, I'm not going to forget until my last day of my life. We saw the chimneys, we saw the smoke, we smelled the flesh, the terrible stench from the burning Jews. And they said, "Go, go, go." They pushed us, "Go." And they were screaming, the old, the sick, the children should go to the left, which meant the crematorium.
Weiss and her family went where they were told. They were led to a man who appeared to be in charge.
There was Dr. Mengele, and he had a finger that determined who should live and who should die. He said, to the left, to the right, to the left.
Weiss's mother, her 12-year-old brother who was ill, and her youngest sister, Rosalie, were all sent to the left.
And when Rosalie saw her 4 sisters to go on the right side, she knew something is very wrong. She let my mother's hand go. And when Dr. Mengele did not look, she ran over to after her four sisters.
Weiss and her sisters remained together through two more selections before being liberated by Soviet troops in 1945. Her mother and brother were among the nearly 6 million Jews murdered under the command of Adolf Hitler.
Okay. So I know that we're running a little bit short on time. So I really want to focus on those last two discussion questions. The first thing I want to ask is how you might incorporate Charlotte's story or testimony into lessons you teach about the Holocaust. I also want you to think about how you might prepare your students to view something like that. Her story is very powerful, but it's also very shocking and graphic as well. And so how do you prepare your students to hear a story like that so that they fully understand what she is talking about, right? And that they fully get a sense of empathy for someone like Charlotte and the victims of the Holocaust. So if anyone has, some answers to that question, I know we're running a little bit short on time, but if anyone has, a few thoughts to that discussion question or that last one, how does Charlotte's story that we just heard connect to this longer history of European anti-Semitism? So I'll give you guys a couple of moments to maybe answer one of those questions in the chat box. Yeah, so I hear, not here, I see Diane say, this might be something to incorporate when teaching night and English class to give another eyewitness testimony. So Ida is saying, this is not something that you could show to students under high school. And I think that's exactly right. That, unless you have spent a lot of time with middle school students, prepping them to hear a story like that, you also have to think about their when they're developmentally ready to hear that kind of story. So I see Carla saying, as a middle school teacher, this one would be very difficult to show as well. I see Mary Beth saying, maybe incorporating this into a discussion of Number the Stars. I really like this idea of incorporating oral history testimony like Charlotte's into maybe English classes as well. And then Harley mentions the 3D testimonies through Shoah Foundation. And then just to point out, the World War II Museum will actually be we're working with the Shoah Foundation and Storyfile to do similar full-length 3D testimonies like those as well. So I know, again, that we're running a little bit short on time. So I'm going to go ahead and sort of wrap up this webinar. And I want to wrap up just by sharing my contact information. I'm going to go ahead and put this in the chat box as well. So if you have any questions for me about the World War II Museum's curriculum resources, or our teacher programs, or even our student programs as well, feel free to email me. Or if you want any physical copies of our curriculum resources or our teacher materials, I can get those to you and ship them to you free of charge. So I went ahead and put my email address in the chat box, but I also wanted to go ahead and share Dori's email and her contact information as well. She will be your point of contact for any content questions you have about her presentation or about any of the resources that the Institute for Curriculum Services offers. And I see that Dori Gerber just put in the evaluation, as well as ways to stay connected with her and her organization. And Mary Beth, I just saw your question. There is not a certificate for professional development for this particular webinar. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dori if you have any final thoughts or ways to conclude the webinar.
I just, want to say thank you to everyone who joined us this afternoon and for your commitment to this topic and to ensuring that the learning doesn't end because it's so important. I wanted to point out, I saw that I thought this was really awesome that in response to Isabel's questions about how to connect what she just saw, which brought me to tears, even though I've seen things like this, I don't know how many times, it's just never, I don't know. It's always new, I guess, and fresh and painful. But Morgan said that Auschwitz is the culmination of 2,000 years of anti-Semitism. If that doesn't encapsulate the connection between what I shared and what Isabel shared, I don't know what does. So thank you for that comment. Again, thank you to everyone. Isabel, thank you for this collaboration.